Hey there! I recently asked, as I do once in a while, on the gram, as the kids say, do you have any questions for me? To be precise, I actually asked, do you have any ueations for me? Because I fully misspelled questions, which is really weird that I didn't notice that. But there we are. My friend Michael, he asked what I thought was actually a very interesting question, and I'm just pulling up his exact wording. He said, "Fude Nibs, period. First of all, I like the dramatic period. Fude Nibs. Any real practicality, or just a specialty nib?" Well, Michael, I'm glad you asked that. I hate Fude Nibs, and so I'm going to talk about them today. And I'm not going to be very negative about them. I think they absolutely have a place. It's just not really for me. Now I have a Fude Nib right here. If you ever see a nib, I don't know, a pen club or a pen show, people are showing you their fountain pens, and it looks like someone dropped their nib, then it's likely a Fude Nib. It's pointed upwards like this. And I've kept this pen. It's a Hongdian pen. I forget the DX or something. I forget the model name. I'm sorry, but look up Hongdian on my website's index and you'll find it. I've saved it because it is a Fude Nib, and once in a while people ask me about Fude Nibs, so I have to be able to say something about it. What I'm going to do is talk about that concept a little bit, and then I'll tilt the camera down. So I'll try to be brief on this end. What is a Fude Nib? Well, a Fude Nib is a nib that looks like it's been dropped on the floor, but that's not its point. Although it is its point, because that's the end that looks like it was dropped on the floor. Okay, now, so you take a nib and you really bend it upwards. My hand apparently cannot go much farther than this, but I mean, that's the idea. Why? Good question. Glad you asked. Because that simulates, at least that's how I understand these nibs, it simulates a brush. And that means that you get, I'll show you, it's much easier to show you when I point the camera down and do some fiddling with this. You can simulate brush strokes. So Fude Nibs are really great if you do Asian calligraphy. So if you like doing it Asian style, then this is great because it allows you to kind of simulate the line variation that you get out of a nib as if you were using a brush, but you're not using a brush because you're using a nib. I can't do Asian calligraphy. I just can't. I know, I don't know, one or two characters, and I will do my very poor version of it and probably get them wrong. If you do Asian calligraphy, or if you are, your native writing is of course ideograms, right? Think of what they use in China or in Japan or in Korea, then this nib may be very attractive to you. But for me, I don't. Now, that's not the reason I hate them. I just really don't like the way they look. The upturned stuff, it always freaks me out a little bit, because I always get the feeling of, did I not push the nib in far enough? Did I bend it when I capped the pen? Something along those lines. Now, having said all this, yes, there is a place for Fude Nibs, namely the Asian calligraphy, or even if you consider that everyday normal writing in ideograms. The other application I know of that I realize some of my friends use them for is artistic purposes. So if you are an artist and you like to draw with fountain pens, Fude Nibs can be very interesting because based on the angle that you use them in, you get a wider or narrower stroke. Again, I will show you this. Is much easier to show than trying to explain. That kind of built-in line variation can be very attractive to artists. My artistic style kind of reached its pinnacle, I would say, in the 4th grade, and it never really progressed beyond that. I have accepted this, I have moved on, I'm not concerned about it. But some people actually know what they're doing, and if you are an artist, then you might want to try to check out one of these nibs, because it gives you a certain level of fun and functionality is what I'm trying to say, that you would not be able to get out of a round tip standard nib. There are some exceptions. Think of zoom nibs, think of naginata nibs, think of there are some options there, but a Fude nib does something that I think is unique. So, fantastic nibs, wonderful, just not really for me. Now what I'm going to do, because I think I've given you the theory adequately, I'm going to point down the camera, tilt it down, I'll grab some paper, I'll write a bit with this, I'll fill it with this, I'll try to show you some of the ups and downs of this nib, and that's the end of it. What I really would like to know is, do you like Fude nibs? And if you like Fude nibs, how do you use them? Because I find that some people just like to have one to play with it and just sort of do things with it, have some fun with it, and all that is great. I have, obviously, like, whatever works for you, fantastic. I don't see it. So I'm genuinely curious how people use theirs, because they're popular and they're selling. So clearly people love this. Share that with me. Okay, enough talk, camera down. Let's get into the action of it all. Okay, so let's talk about this Fude nib, I'm not sure I've ever really seen a tipped Fude nib. I think typically they don't really have any tipping. I'll try to show you that on this pen. Certainly a nice enough pen, this Hongdian, oh, it actually says 1861 Pro. I guess I did have the model number. Anyway, it's a nice pen, solid metal. I've always quite liked it. And then here you have a number 5 nib, Fude style. So you see that upturned shape quite well. I'll really try to zoom in so you can really see this if you've never seen a Fude nib. And so the idea with this is, again, it simulates brush strokes. But then one thing that I found is that depending on the angle at which the nib hits the paper, you get a wider or a narrower line. And again, I think if you're an artist, that might be very beneficial. If you know how to do the proper style of calligraphy, which again, I do not, that might be beneficial, but to me it is not. So what I would like to do is just kind of grab some paper, fiddle a bit with it, try to show you some things. I'm certainly not a Fude expert. There are people online who can do way more with this than I can, but I mean, here we go. So I'm going to start off with as much of that upturned bit on the paper as possible to give you an overview of what that would look like. And if you like broad nibs, which I do, that's not a secret either, well, then a Fude nib is interesting because it is indeed a very broad line. The issue lies more so in, is it maybe too broad? So I'm going to give you, sorry for the suspense, a quick comparison. This is an Asvine pen, a Chinese fountain pen, but here we have a broad nib. Now, this is not the broadest broad I've ever seen, but it is a Jowo nib, ubiquitous, widely available, all that. And you can see it's fairly broad writing. Now we're going to whip out that Fude nib, and again, I'll start off with as much of the upturned bit on the paper as possible. You always have to fiddle a bit with your writing angle, but so here we have a Fude nib. So you can see an incredibly wide line and wet too. This is just a cartridge that it's a Chinese cartridge. I think it may have come with this pen because it fit. So I can't say much about the ink. But that would be a Fude experience. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to try to vary the angle, getting to a sort of steeper angle to the point where it's almost perpendicular to the paper. So I always forget what's a low and a high angle, sorry, but I mean, so low angle is what I just did. So this is that flat upturned bit entirely on the page. Now, if I make that angle a bit higher, right? So now I have maybe about half of that upturned bit on the page. you see it gets much narrower. If I make it like even, I take it even further to the point where it's perpendicular. It's a very odd way, perpendicular, sorry, it's very difficult to write holding a pen that peculiar angle. You can see now you have something that I would call an extra fine. This is not even a fine nib anymore. This is an extra fine nib. So you can go from that to this. And that is certainly interesting and attractive, I would say, if you are an artist, right? I'm not even talking about what the nibs were designed for, which is the calligraphy, ideograms, etc. But as an artist, this might be very helpful to you. So I will, so here, for example, we have a face. You can play with things and add shading to it. This is not where the shading would be in a face. That's because I'm not an artist. But so you can get that. You can get that line variation out of it in a very natural sense without needing a nib that you flex and open up the tines under pressure. This just works because of the natural shape of the nib. And then, as if all of that's not enough, usually with Fude Nibs, I haven't actually tried this before I hit record, so this might be a massive fail, you can flip them over, and then you have a very fine bit of nib. Now this is so fine that here it starts to not really want to put down ink anymore. Again, some of these Fude Nibs, they work better this upside down than others. And again, you can still hold it perpendicular to the page and you can get that very fine line too. But really you have a single nib that goes, I would say, from extra fine to whatever this is. That's not broad, that's not double broad. I think now you're getting to a triple broad, if not a quadruple broad line. And that can be very attractive to people. Now, I'm going to make a fool of myself, and I'm sorry. Again, I can't really do ideograms. I only know a couple, and I'm probably going to mess that up too. So I believe there is this one. I can't even put it down normally. I want to say this is she in Japanese, as in man, but correct me if I'm wrong. Here, even for a complete idiot like me who doesn't know what he's doing, you can kind of see the point, right? Because like with a brush, you can get narrower and wider strokes depending on what you're doing. Now again, I don't know what I'm doing, so I don't know what it should look like, but I mean, I can make something look like maybe that's what it's supposed to look like, is what I'm saying. And in this world, that's enough to be an expert at anything, right? Just if you think you're an expert, then apparently that's enough. So that's the world we live in. It has, as a nib, it has a little bit of that architect quality where an italic nib has a broad downstroke and a narrow side stroke. Note that I turned the pen to the side. An architect nib has a narrow downstroke and a much broader, that was not the best, a much broader side stroke. And here too, right, note how these side strokes have a brush-like quality in their intensity. So if that's what you're looking for and you want something to fiddle with, to play with, to give you that extra fine through broad in a single nib, this is the way to do it. You can get a zoom nib made by Sailor. You can get a Naginata Togi nib made by Sailor, which does something a little bit like that. You can get the very fancy nibs, cross points or King Eagles or those kinds of things, all Sailor nibs. But this is, those are very, very expensive. This is much simpler. It's only number 5. It's steel. It's quite affordable. But if you really want that, you can get that. By the way, did you see the accident? I had a purple ink thing going on. Anyway, so that is an option. Now, the one thing I say that can be quite interesting with this, and I'm just off camera, I'm just priming that feed a little bit with some more ink, so that it's not, because I'm going to do some fast strokes here. I'm not going to do my signature, but if you want something for bold signatures, this could be very interesting, right? Because you do get a very wide line. And if you allow me to, one sec, Here is that broad Yovo nib. I don't know what I just did. I made up that thing on the spot, but that's what you would get with a broad nib. So you see a massive difference. So if expressiveness is something that matters to you, this too I think is a great nib. So I'm going to leave it at this because I don't want to bore you to death. I hope I haven't done so already. Here are my thoughts on Fude Nibs. Michael, I hope I have given you something to work with. They're fun. They're not for me. I don't really know what to actually do with them beyond what I've shown here, which is amateur hour at best, but maybe it's given you something to work with. I hope that was useful, and I'm glad to see you later. Bye.